on the podcast today, we have a candidate for North Carolina Auditor, Bob Drach. Bob, welcome to Philosophisn't, this Philosophisn't the Average interview. On this show, we like to ask candidates not just their platform and the current going-ons of politics, but to dive a little deeper into what actually inspired them intellectually and morally. And so welcome to Philosophisn't. How are you today?
Good, Rowan. Thanks. It's nice to be here. And Matthew, nice to see you.
Nice seeing
All right.
you again.
I'll let Matt start off with his questions about the campaign. You want to go ahead, Matt?
I guess one of the first questions I'll ask is, why do you think the NC State auditor position is so important, and why they should not be a Democrat or a Republican?
Okay, so two answers there. Why is it important? Well, financial management in state government is hugely important. It's a $30 billion enterprise, the state government. And then if you layer on top the federal money that comes through the state is managed by state actors, it's north of 50 billion. That's a lot of opportunity for waste, fraud, and abuse. And the auditor's office, their specific charge of the auditor's office is to look for waste, fraud, and abuse. And of course, everyone in government should be doing that. But the fact that the auditor year after year finds mismanagement in state government, that underscores the need for, call it a watchdog, a taxpayer's watchdog, or a citizen's watchdog. Let's make sure that the taxes that are collected and the programs that the legislature intends to benefit the citizens actually benefit the citizens. So that's why the job is important. It's the watchdog and it's the spokesperson for sound financial management practices in the state government. Now, an auditor should be independent, not a Republican, not a Democrat. And that goes back to some of the founding principles of what audit and attestation services are all about, right? When a company, a public company, publishes its financial statements to shareholders, it uses an independent, a third-party auditor, right? Everyone understands, and the American Institute of CPAs says that an auditor needs to be independent in both fact and appearance, right? We all know in politics, the appearance of a conflict of interest, right? We're in like, just look at the presidential candidates, right? If their sons or their sons-in-laws seem to be leveraging their daddy's, position as president, we all scream. We say, hey, that's a conflict of interest. That's not right. So people understand that in a government that's dominated by Republicans and Democrats, it's a conflict of interest, or at least it appears to be a conflict of interest when the Republicans or the Democrats are auditing themselves.
And you think that creates like cynicism in government, or do you think that creates cynicism in government, or is the problem that it makes people think that there's abuse? Because I'm hearing you say that the problem is the appearance of a conflict of interest. And so how does the appearance of conflict of interest differ from like an actual conflict of interest itself? Are you saying the problem is that there's cynicism behind it when people don't trust their government anymore?
I think that's a rhetorical question, isn't it? Of course there's cynicism.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's what you're saying. It sounds like that's what you're implying, so I wanted to clear it out.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And if you look at the history of the state auditor's office, it used to be a much broader position. It had a lot more financial management responsibilities, but the state legislature has cut that back, cut that back, cut that back. Mm-hmm. And why have they done that? Well, because when the auditor was a Republican and the Democrats had control of the legislature, they cut back on what the auditor could do.
Wow.
So it's I think it's just as it's a natural human instinct to, when there's an opportunity for fraud, some people will commit fraud. I think it's also natural for humans, if the party is in power and they're responsible for auditing their party that's in power, it's going to make a difference. So that's why it's so important that the auditor be independent.
Bob, I have some very, very minor experience as a bookkeeper. And before that, as a student in college, I was very interested in how government spent its money. When individuals spend their money, it's up to them to decide if it's worth it. But when government spends taxpayer money, one thing I learned is that it's ob much more obscure to find out if they're actually making good deals. Like I looked at Guilford County's bid website, and interestingly, you can easily find the bids for vendors and see if their starting price is good. But why not? Why isn't the public able to see the finished price, the price at which the bids are filled? And that seemed very strange to me. And also, um, my original idea for the thesis work I was going to do in order to graduate was to see there's a lot of hearsay that some counties just spend more on the same things than others. That the Wake Forest County Schools spends 3 times less on air conditioning, and Guilford County Schools spends 3 times as much, and it's the same thing. And I got fascinated. So if government's spending the money like this, then there's clearly something that's an inefficiency that could be done for less strain on the public purse. But when I tried to look into that route of research, it was too I just couldn't find those specific figures like that line by line. But you're the auditor, you can see those specific figures line by line more than anyone else. And so I'm so curious to ask, like, what is your view on that? It does this do governments like ever pay way more than the regular market price? Or if they do, what are the conditions when they do that?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's so broad, right? I mean, we talked about a $30 billion state government. We
Right.
haven't even touched the federal government. And, it's even worse than you've described, Roman, because it's not only that people are spending other people's money, they're spending future generations' money. There are people, if you look at the federal government, there are unborn babies and unborn, citizens that haven't crossed the border yet and attained citizenship. They're going to pay for the money that's being spent right now. There's a whole branch of philosophy, agency theory, and people tend to, if they're spending their own money, then they'll be more responsible.
Trade off.
But if someone else is spending money, well, they want that person to buy everything for them.
It's like if you have
called
a
an
gift card
agentic shift.
right. I think the key is there's no opportunity cost. Because if I have a gift card at Starbucks, then I'm gonna spend everything at Starbucks that I want to get because the money doesn't apply to anything else. It's not money if I take it elsewhere. And so I really wondered if the same thing just happens in government, where you say if you earmark this money for this specific cause, then it's not like the money can be used on anything else anyway. It's like a gift card for that one specific area of spending. And the original research I wanted to do was to look at that and see if that actually created less efficiency. But because of, I guess I'm not intelligent enough, or I didn't know the right resources to find, I couldn't really test that theory and figure it out if it was true or not. So what I'm trying to ask is, do you see that there's something like that happens when you're auditing?
Yeah. Well, and that's exactly the kind of thing that the auditor should be looking at. But I talked about the problem of scale. The auditor's office right now is about 120 people. And at least half of what they do are financial audits. These are recurring audits of financial statements of the public universities, community colleges, state colleges. So if you look at the other half of what they're doing, it's maybe 60 people in a $30 billion state government that are looking for the kinds of problems that you just described, right? So, of course, they're not going to be able to handle even a fraction of the problem. But what they can do is they can establish solid financial management practices for those areas that they choose to investigate. And so they can provide, financial leadership in that way. Even though there are only 120 people in the auditor's office, if you look throughout state government, there are thousands of people who are working in financial management roles. So the state auditor has something of a bully pulpit. A second thing the state auditor has is a hotline for tips. If anyone in state government or any citizen believes there's waste, fraud, or abuse, they should report it to this hotline that's maintained at the state auditor's office. And of course, the state auditor can't look at everything, but it's interesting. Studies of financial fraud have found that 60% of fraud can be hidden from auditors. So just doing a financial audit is really not enough. What you really need is an insider, a whistleblower. You need somebody who sees the problem to report it. And so the hotline is so very important because that's where most of the waste, fraud, and abuse is actually going to be discovered. So in the example you discussed, school systems paying 3 times more for the same services or products.
But that's hearsay. I really couldn't test it. Like I couldn't figure out if that was true because budget they publish give very general information, and so that's why I'm lumping a lot on you. I know, but I was so curious if the phenomenon that I thought would happen would actually happen.
Yeah. So again, that specific example we probably can't dig into. The state auditor could dig into it. One way I mentioned the hotline for tips. And I mentioned the recurring audits. A third way that the state auditor initiates a project is when the legislature includes it in a bill. The legislature says the auditor shall look at this. So one thing that the auditor was instructed to look at recently was the effect of the school shutdowns on student performance, student attendance and performance. So that's kind of along the lines of what you were saying, that the state legislature said, hey, let's look at budgets across the school systems and compare spending levels. The state auditor could do something like that.
Well, that's exactly what I ended up doing for my research, and the result I found was really interesting. I was expecting that there would be some program or some type of expense that schools engage in that results in better outcomes. And I just categorically didn't find that. What I did find was that more teachers per student results in better outcomes. But more surprisingly, although it's not too surprising, is that the strongest predictor of whether a school would do well or not was whether the money was sourced locally. So since I couldn't go line by line and see like if money is actually being spent in what looks like a reasonable way, all I had was the aggregate figures, like the just the aggregate of how the money splits up. This percent of it is federal, this percent of it is state, this percent of it is local. The percentage of money that's local, holding for account other variables. So holding for account the wealth of the district, and holding for account the number of teachers per student. If the money is sourced locally, it seems to go a lot farther. My idea for this is that it must mean that means that the county and the county government and the school district board are in agreement, that they're working well together, they're getting all their funding requests met, and they're doing things long term. And I wanted to ask, do you have another idea of why this result might be?
Well,
because it was
as you know, I'm running as a libertarian, and the libertarian belief is that an individual is going to make better decisions than a faraway government, and that a government that's closer to the source is better than a government that's further away from the source. And that's kind of in line with the findings that you're telling me. So I would say that's a strongly libertarian result, and not surprising at all that communities that are engaged and supportive of their schools are going to have better outcomes, and that no amount of federal spending or state spending can compensate for what local communities and families can do to improve educational outcomes.
Thank you, Bob. Matt, do you have other questions?
Oh, I was just gonna ask, like, why do you think lawyers would want an audit position rather than a position that fits more with their experience and degree? Because from what I've seen on your website and what you've talked about, you have your degree goes more to this, and that you actually have experience auditing.
Yeah, I'm a certified management accountant. And it's just crazy that I am the only accountant that's running for state auditor. It boggles my mind. And I really have a great time when I'm out canvassing. Like yesterday, I was in Benson at their Mule Days festival and just talking with people on the street. And it's almost like a joke. We share a smile. I tell them I'm an accountant and I'm running for auditor. And they look at me and they say, of course. I mean, why is that important? And after a pause, I'll say, well, I'm the only candidate that's an auditor. And we both chuckle a little bit, like that's crazy. So why would a lawyer or why would a plumber or an electrician want to be an auditor? Well, we've got this idea in the United States of a government by the citizens. And I think we do when we look at the legislature. Of course, it's an advantage to be a lawyer, understand the law, understand how laws are written, to be a legislature. But we have this idea that we want other citizens to participate in setting the law. So, you'd expect a mixed set of candidates for that. For something like the Attorney General, the people who drafted the Constitution in North Carolina, they actually said, you must be a lawyer to be Attorney General. That's a requirement. You have to be recognized by the bar. Well, likewise, I think we can look at a job like auditor and say the framers of the Constitution, North Carolina Constitution, should have said, hey, you've got to be an accountant to be an auditor. I mean, it's just one of those things that just makes sense. It's a highly technocratic position. It's not really setting policy. It's trying to establish sound financial management practices and protect the interests of the taxpayer. Because we can't go back and rewrite the Constitution, we have to live with what we've got today. It's up to the citizens when they have a choice between someone who's qualified as an accountant and maybe someone who's less qualified to choose the better candidate.
It sort of reminds me of how like why are judge positions partisan races? It seems so wrong that you're voting for a Republican sheriff or a Democratic sheriff because those are positions where you're supposed to do the job for not to form new policy, but to follow the law in the service of the community as best as you can, right?
Yeah, you're preaching to the choir, and there should be a lot of positions that are nonpartisan. Yeah.
I mean, is there any logic behind it at all? Like, what would a Democratic auditor do differently than a Republican auditor? Like, what do auditor races usually look like? I guess what becomes the talking points?
Well, sorry, I'm going to just answer why would a Democrat or a Republican, why would you want to vote partisan there? And I think one reason for partisan elections is it's easier for voters to understand maybe some of the ideas of the candidate they're voting for, and if they align on those broad political basis or not. We've seen that a lot of people will just do straight party line voting. But many people are, have the skepticism or are raising the questions that you're raising. And if you look in North Carolina's voter registration, almost 40% of voters now register unaffiliated. And that's significant because they have a choice. They could register Republican, they could register Democrat, but they choose not to. They choose to be unaffiliated because they don't align well with one side or the other. So I think that the electorate is changing in a way that independent and unaffiliated candidates should have a bigger opportunity for success. And if these trends continue, straight party line voting and the advantage of running as one party or another begins to dissipate. The last thing I'll point out is, we know that the laws for elections are written by Democrats and Republicans, and so they do everything they possibly can to disadvantage and to shut out independent voices. And that may be another reason that the election laws are written the way they are. So for any partisan position, you really have to run in a party primary, and you have to have party support. And that's the importance of the Libertarian Party. The Libertarian Party is it's something of a middle ground. It's the largest of the third parties that are out there, and gives independent voters an opportunity to see candidates that may align with their views.
I see.
Well, how would a state auditor biasness look like? Would they falsely document audits, or like what would that look like?
I guess like I guess
the,
what we're asking is like what is it that you're announcing if you're saying I'm running as a Democratic auditor, here's why you should vote for me as a Democratic auditor? Are you announcing that, oh, I'm going to be more lenient when auditing the Democrats' pet projects, or I'm going to be more lax and try to make public spending more easier? Like, what's
Yes.
It's very hard to see why there has to be an ideology behind auditing at all.
Yeah. So I'm going to answer the questions in that order. So Matthew asked, what would that look like? Well, I mentioned earlier, the legislature asked the auditor to look at school outcomes in the schools after during the COVID lockdowns. And the auditor is a Democrat. The governor is a Democrat. The legislature is Republican. So I think it was 2001, the legislature said, hey, let's look at the outcomes in the school systems. And they said in 2021, they said, by June of 2022, we would like you to report on outcomes, truancy rates, and student achievement. Well, the auditor went to work and focused on 4 school systems in the state to try to collect the data. The first thing they found was they couldn't collect the data. The school systems weren't keeping it. So they went in and they did a deep dive into the record-keeping systems of 2 school systems. And in the end, they only got results from a single school system.
Wow.
And what they found was that during the COVID lockdowns, truancy rates increased by 10% at that one school system. And of course, educational outcomes declined significantly. So that's what they found, but they did not report until October of 2023. Now, they were supposed to report in June of 2022. What happened between 2022 and 2023? Well, the legislature and the governor were fighting back and forth about school vouchers and funding for alternate education. And the auditor had this information that said public schools and the policies adopted during COVID led to worse educational outcomes for those students.
Basically, that had failed us, kind of.
You could read it that way. And certainly in the political environment, that was fodder for the legislature for their preferred policy positions. And it was information that the governor would prefer not to see for his preferred policy position. Now, there may be lots of reasons why the auditor was 16 months late in publishing this information. And it may be coincidence that they published it after the policy debate was largely over. But that's what conflict of interest looks like. And it may have been a conflict of interest, right?
That certainly seems like it.
Yeah. And so again, whether it really was or it wasn't, the questions are raised because the auditor is a Democrat and the governor is a Democrat.
Well, to sort of play devil's advocate here, I don't have a strong position on the issue of are school vouchers for charter schools? Like you have a voucher to have money to spend on a charter school? Is that how it works?
Yeah, I think the way the vouchers work are families will apply for a voucher, and if it's accepted, then the state will pay to the educational institution a fraction of the per student cost
Got it.
that would have been spent on that same student in the public schools.
I've met people who are really passionate opponents of charter schools because they say that's the primary reason why, or one of the primary reasons why the mainstream public schools are underfunded is that the money gets funneled off in a way that's even less easy to track, or that it's funneled off in a way that will only benefit part of the community. Like I found that to be a pretty strange argument because there's also mainstream public schools that are just like created by the school board, which are kind of like designed to only benefit a certain sector of students. Like I went to a very prestigious early college, and then I realized, like, so this is a public school that's designed to only benefit a very certain sector of students. If that's acceptable because the school is considered a public school, why is that then unacceptable when it's considered a charter school?
Yeah, I'm not going to take a strong position on schools, partly because I may be asked to look at educational outcomes or spending across different types of schools, or do an audit that addresses one of those issues. So I prefer not to advocate for any policy position over the other.
No, I'm
But
not.
I would agree.
Yeah, it's just very funny. Like, if you have a school that's doing the same thing as a charter school, but you call it public, then people will just like outright support it because it's nominally public. If you have a charter school that's doing the same thing as a public school, then people oppose it because of the name charter school. Not to say you have to take a position. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that, if there's any real basis behind that, or if that's just something where people have been fooled by labels.
Well, it's super interesting because earlier in our conversation,
Yeah,
we were talking about educational outcomes, and the closer the funding is to the community,
right,
the better the outcomes.
right.
And I think the proponents of vouchers and charter schools believe that with the parents and the students making the decision and effectively directing the funding, that potentially could lead to better outcomes. That seems to be what you found when you looked at it.
It's to be honest, my argument was less conclusive than a thesis should be. I guess that's due to my inexperience as a researcher. It could be one of the interesting results I found is that when administrators requested a funding increase for administrative purposes, it seemed much more likely that that request would be met by the county than if teachers requested an increase. If the budget had a budget request to hire more teachers, then that was less likely to be met than the request that administrators make, even though the thing that actually helps students, according to what the data shows, is more teachers per student. So there's a variety of reasons why that result could have happened. And I think the strongest evidence shows that it's because a low percentage of the money coming from the county means that the county and school district governments aren't really in alignment. Like it could be like a Republican county and a Democratic school district. And so then they're fighting over the money. Like that's what happened here in Guilford. I don't know if you're familiar with the school bond issue, but it kept getting worse and worse until voters decided to vote for issuing school bonds but not for a sales tax to pay for them. And so now Guilford County is really in a tricky position financially. You'll probably audit us if you get elected.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. And as a parent and having sent kids to school, a couple kids through school, we always prioritized education. And I was in California 20 years ago, maybe it's 25 years ago now, when the first school voucher bills were being floated in California. And always found it interesting. People would say, "Hey, vouchers, they just benefit the rich. You know, they're just paying for the subsidizing the rich to go to school."
There's also public schools that disproportionately benefit the rich if it's a public school in a richer area.
Yeah, and you know, rich is a relative term. If education is the most important priority for you, and you forego a new car, you don't go on vacation, or you live in a smaller house so you can afford paying more for your kids' education, then you do that. And so I always felt that parents who made the decision to send their kids to private school or to supplement their kids' learning in some way, they're not getting any extra taxpayer benefit. They've already made that decision, right? It really benefits the people who are on the margin, who would love to send their kids to a different school, and the voucher then it puts them over the top and gives them that opportunity. So I like empowering people to make their own financial decisions, and but I also believe that public education is an important social good, and it's an important role of the government to make sure that every student, regardless of means and other limitations, has an opportunity to develop to their fullest potential.
I want to ask one more thing. What do you think of public sector unions?
Public sector unions?
Yeah. That's another polarized issue of people viewing it as another conflict of interest, that you're working for the government and you have a union.
Yeah, I think that the history of unions and the main benefit of unions is when employers are abusive and they have the ability to intimidate or exert undue influence over an individual employee. The union, the collective power of all the employees, is a good way to resist that coercion. So I think the existence of public sector unions is evidence that the government is coercive and potentially abusive, and there's a need for collective action to resist that.
I see. Matt, do you have any other questions?
Well, there's a few questions that I don't know if they necessarily go with what you're running for, but there were a few people that I spoke to that were wanting to know things like, do you support crypto, and do you support going back to the gold standard? And if you don't support the gold standard, do you think crypto backing the US dollar would be a better placement?
Hey, I think crypto is extremely intriguing, mostly because of the blockchain technology. And, one of the dangers of a digital currency, like a federal digital currency, is that blockchain, a potential benefit is the blockchain allows an audit trail, but without a lot of individual disclosing a lot of additional individual information. So it's attractive for that reason, but it does also provide an audit trail that allows the government or other private actors to look at what should be private transactions.
How is it compared to the audit trail that's created when banks record things on their ledgers, when banks facilitate the transaction of funds?
Yeah, I mean, if we've got an accepted, there's accepted norms and principles around the tracking of financial information by banks, but some of those norms and principles are, you can't do transactions over $10,000 without additional layers of reporting. And cash is almost eliminated from our society, and there are pluses and minuses of that. So I'm not giving you a straight answer, I know, on a position on crypto, but it's an interesting contrast to gold. I mean, people like the idea of gold as a reservoir of value, or as a measure of value that could be used for trade or commerce, because it sets a standard that's you can't be manipulated by a central bank or a federal reserve system. And I think that's going to be a challenge for societies. It's been one for a long time, and it will continue to be one. Is what's the right medium of exchange? There are some societies that use barter. In some ways, that's superior to using crypto or
yeah, certainly.
Gold. Gold. The idea was that you'd have a note that represented gold, and you'd barter the gold for whatever you wanted to buy.
Well, it's interesting you say that because I'm reading the book Web of Debt by Ellen Brown now, and money used to be much more of a receipt rather than a claim, because kings would issue tallies, literally where they break a stick in half, and there's only one half of a stick that matches, and so you know that the service was delivered because you match up sticks like that, and it's not so much a claim on a gold in a fractional reserve system that may or may not be backed up, but it's money. I guess bartering systems, money expands more organically than with our system, where we have a centralized Federal Reserve that has to determine at what rate will the money expand, at what rate will allow like new lending to happen.
Yeah, no, the rate that money expands, the velocity of the money supply, that's huge. And those are actually a few strong arguments for crypto. Yeah. With crypto, you can get extremely high velocity. And there are people that love Bitcoin. They say, hey, well, there's a limited amount of Bitcoin. Yeah, but if you can get velocity up, you don't need very much Bitcoin, right? I think it's really healthy to have multiple measures of value and to look at several different mediums of exchange, because no one of them is perfect. And by having alternatives, you have a better possibility of keeping them in balance. You won't have to worry about the Hunt brothers cornering the silver market, for example, or the Federal Reserve artificially inflating a digital currency, or the more opportunities the market has for facilitating transactions,
more competition between
better.
Mediums. That's so interesting. Those are all the questions I have. Matt, do you have anything else?
I got a couple about like the campaign and stuff, and I was just wondering, what do you think the biggest obstacle is for your campaign currently? And if you were to win, what would it be in the auditor position?
Okay, so the biggest challenge is just getting the mind share of 2 million North Carolinians, because every person I speak to, when I tell them, hey, I'm an accountant and I'm running for auditor, I'm independent and an auditor should be independent, it clicks. People get it. It's a compelling message. And there are a few people who are tribal and believe they should vote R or V because they don't mind the conflict of interest. They want that bias. But most people get it. The audit, to best protect the interests of the taxpayers and the citizens of North Carolina, we need a competent, independent auditor. So getting the word out. And that's why I tell people to tell others, right? It's very important that people understand, hey, the state auditor sets the tone for financial management in North Carolina, and that here we have a qualified independent candidate. I think when I become state auditor, the two biggest challenges are going to be staffing and technology. There are great people that have stuck with the state auditor's office through what must have been a very difficult time. The former state auditor had to resign because of ethical issues, and the current auditor is a political appointee. And when you're in a profession that relies on integrity and a system of values and professional ethics, that's a terrible environment to work in. So we need to reinforce the staff that exists. We need to continue to recruit talent into the state auditor's office, and we need to rebuild the organization into a dynamic and in some ways ferocious, protector of the taxpayer's interests. And of course, it's funny. Several years ago, I was telling a friend about my manufacturing company, and I said, "Hey, we bend metal, we weld and paint steel and make construction materials, but we're really a technology company." And my friend just looked at me deadpan, and he said, "Bob, all companies are technology companies." And that's true throughout our society now. We live in a technology society, and every enterprise is a technology enterprise. And the state auditor's office, whatever their level of technology, we know it's got to accelerate. We've got to look at what's on the horizon, the next generation of technology, and use that to leverage the human resources that we have in the office. Fortunately, I've got some background in technology. My last job.
No worries.
Just when we were talking about technology too.
Yeah, ironically.
I guess one of the final questions that I'll finish with is, and this is going back to some of the stuff that we talked about with the current auditor and the past auditor, and do you think if you win the North Carolina auditor position that it would disrupt or uncover some of the things that the two parties have been hiding? Because I know you said a little ways back it was like it took 16 months to get an audit fulfilled, and I was just wondering, do you think there's a possibility that perhaps there's some that go even further back that they just haven't filed, but they say that they're working on?
Well, yeah, I think there's a strong possibility, and there are really two or three interesting pieces there, Matthew. One is that the productivity of the office has declined. The WRAL did an analysis, and it was interesting. I talked to their reporter. I did a similar analysis. If you go back to April, the last auditor resigned in December. If you go back to April, there were probably several audits in process at that point in time. But if you look back to April, audits are down by about 20%, or audit reports that have been published are down by about 20%. So there's going to be a certain amount of triage that needs to be done in the auditor's office, just kind of recovering from the organizational disruption that's existed the last couple of years. And so it might not be a very impressive first year, at least externally. We've got some triage to do within the office. But the other thing that would happen for the unaffiliated voters, the 40% of North Carolina voters that are out there, if they actually exert their will, if they vote their convictions, if they elect somebody to the Council of State who's not a Republican and not a Democrat, that will send shockwaves well beyond the scope of the state auditor's office. So I'll be in there trying to keep my head down, do the triage, make the office effective, and look for evidence of waste, fraud, and abuse that may have been missed by prior auditors. But there'll be a political earthquake in North Carolina while people come to terms with the fact that an independent candidate can win an election.
I mean, that would also go on if Mike Ross wins the governor and Shannon Bray wins lieutenant governor.
Yeah, and Sean Hoffer for agricultural commissioner. I mean, these state level races, they have the opportunity to create a huge sea change within politics. And you mentioned the Mike Ross. I'm glad you did, because Mike is being strongly looked at as an alternative for the people who look at the Democrat and Republican and say, hey, there's scandal there or there are policies there that I don't agree with. I think we'll see Mike Ross surging here over the next couple of weeks.
Oh yeah, it's I think this is your campaign and Mike's campaign is two campaigns I've been most excited for, especially on a state level. Yeah, I think it would just be amazing if you and him could win your elections.
Good. Well, thanks for your support and your excitement. I share it.
Okay, I think we can wrap it up here. And by the way, we do have an episode with Mike Ross. We discussed a lot of things, and so check that out too. This has been really great talking to you, Bob.